Prison horror stories. When I got sentenced, I thought 2 years was no big deal. I mean, it was just a bar fight. Sure, I broke the guy's nose, but it wasn't like I killed him. I'd never even been in trouble before. I figured I'd keep my head down, do my time, and get out. Easy, right? But that was all a lie I told myself to sleep at night. The minute those bars slammed shut, I realized how stupid I was. You don't just do your time in a place like this. I was just a kid, barely 19, and the place was filled with hardened criminals, guys who spent more time behind bars than I'd been alive. The first day was the worst. I tried to keep to myself, but it didn't take long for some of the older guys to sniff out fresh meat. They could smell the fear on me like blood in the water. It wasn't long before a group of them cornered me in the yard, led by a guy they called Big Dave. He had a shaved head, muscles like a pit bull, and a spiderweb tattoo creeping up his neck.
"Hey, kid,"
he said, his voice like gravel.
"You looking to join up with your own kind? Or you want to get real familiar with the inside of the infirmary?"
I didn't even know what he meant at first. I'd heard about prison gangs, sure, but I didn't think it applied to me. I wasn't racist or anything, I just wanted to stay out of trouble. But in here, that choice wasn't mine to make. You either join a gang, or you become everyone's target. And it wasn't like I had the option to join the Mexican or black gangs. Not that I wanted to, they wouldn't have me. I was white, and that means I had to stick with the Aryan Brotherhood, or AB, whether I liked it or not. Big Dave wasn't giving me a choice, so I nodded, figuring that was all it would take. But I was wrong. Dead wrong. A couple days later, one of the other AB guys, a dude named Mitch, came up to me in the shower block. He was skinny, with a mean look in his eyes, and a scar that ran from his eyebrow to his chin. He shoved a shank into my hand, a piece of sharpened metal, cold and heavy.
"You want to be with us? You gotta earn it,"
he hissed, his voice barely above a whisper.
"See that guy over there?"
He jerked his head towards a Mexican dude on the opposite side of the showers.
"His name's Jorge. He's been eyeballing our stash in the yard. He's gotta go, and you're gonna do it."
My stomach dropped. I felt like I was going to puke right there. I can't do that," I stammered, my voice trembling. Mitch grabbed me by the collar and slammed me against the wall, the cold tiles pressing into my back.
"You either shank that piece of shit, or we'll do it to you. And trust me, kid, it won't be quick."
I didn't have a choice. My hands were shaking so bad I thought I dropped the shank, but somehow I kept hold of it as I walked across the shower block, every step feeling like it was dragging me to my own grave. Jorge was facing the wall, humming to himself, completely oblivious. I almost stopped right there, but Mitch's eyes were burning into me from behind. I gripped the shank so hard my knuckles turned white. I told myself it was him or me, but that didn't make it any easier. I don't even remember plunging the blade into his back, but suddenly it was in, and Jorge was screaming, a sound that will haunt me for the rest of my life. Blood sprayed everywhere, mixing with the water on the floor, and I just stood there, frozen. As Jorge collapsed, it felt like hours passed before Mitch yanked me back. His face twisted into a grin.
"Welcome to the Brotherhood,"
he said, and that was it. They pulled me out of there, and we left Jorge to bleed out on the floor. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, the way it twisted in pain and shock, and the blood. So much blood. After that, I was one of them, but I never felt like I belonged. The others were laughing, joking how I had finally manned up, but I didn't feel like a man. I felt like a monster. I had nightmares every night, and whenever I saw another Mexican guy in the yard, I'd feel my heart race, terrified that they'd know what I had done. I started counting down the days until I could get out, but I knew that even when I was free, I'd never really escape. Jorge's blood was on my hands, and no amount of time would wash it away. I'd gone in for a bar fight, just a stupid mistake, but prison turned me into something else. Something that I couldn't even recognize. 2 years. It felt like a life sentence. When I first hit the yard, I was green, lost, and ready to do whatever it took to survive. That's when Jason, a long-timer with a nasty reputation, took me under his wing. At first, I thought I'd caught a break. He showed me the ropes, kept me out of the worst trouble, and I figured I had a decent ally. But it was all a setup. Jason had a plan, and I was just a pawn. One night, he handed me a package wrapped in brown paper with a slick grin. "This is gonna make us both some cash," he said. "Just be smart with it." I didn't ask questions. I took the package, thinking it was another routine hustle. Little did I know, I was being set up. A few hours later, I was yanked from my cell by the guards. They tore the place apart and found the package. Inside were bags of heroin, coke, and bundles of meth. They tossed me into solitary, and that's where things went south. In isolation, the guards laid into me. They were rough, demanding answers that I didn't have. They trashed my cell, ripped my clothes, and every attempt I made to explain was met with more violence. I was beaten and battered, left alone in the dark. Days later, when they finally let me out, I was a marked man. Word had spread. I was branded a snitch, Jason's pawn. Life on the inside turned brutal. Every day, I had to fight for scraps, food, space, and respect. I was constantly in brawls. My face was swollen, and my ribs took a beating. Jason had vanished, leaving me to handle the fallout. One night, a group of guys grabbed me and dragged me into a dark corner of the yard. They were furious, their anger explosive. They pounded on me, shouting about my betrayal. I fought back, but it was a losing battle. They left me bruised and broken, a stark reminder of my misplaced trust. The worst part wasn't the beatings, it was the isolation. I was left to fend for myself in a hostile environment, constantly watching my back. The few allies that I thought I had turned their backs, fearing retribution. Every day was a struggle, and every night was spent in dread. The guards, who once turned a blind eye, now had no sympathy for my plight. They watched with cold eyes as I struggled to stay alive. Now that I'm out, the scars are still there, both physical and the constant reminder that I got played. I'm sharing this story so people know the stakes. In a place like that, trust is a luxury you can't afford. Jason used me, and I paid the price in blood and bruises. It's a harsh lesson about survival and the cost of deception in a world where every move counts. I should let you know, I'm a woman. I'll never forget the day I was thrown into that hellhole. I was barely 17, scared out of my mind, and completely lost. The prison was a grim fortress of concrete and metal, and I had no idea how to navigate the chaos of life behind bars. For the first few weeks, I kept my head down, trying to blend in. I thought that if I stayed invisible, I'd be safe, but safety was a luxury I could hardly afford. It wasn't long before I noticed Officer Harris. He was one of the guards that seemed to take an unusual interest in me. At first, I brushed it off as paranoia, but his glances, the way he lingered around my cell, it made my skin crawl. One night, as I was trying to sleep, I heard a knock on my cell door. Officer Harris was standing there, his face hidden in the shadows. He told me there was a problem with my paperwork and that I had to come with him. I hesitated but followed, not wanting to draw attention. He led me to a back room, away from the main cell block. The place was dimly lit, filled with the stale smell of disinfectant. He shut the door behind us, and suddenly, the atmosphere changed. Harris's demeanor shifted from professional to predatory. "You know," he said, stepping closer, "you've been real quiet around here. Sometimes quiet people need a little attention." I tried to back away, but my heart was racing, and my limbs felt like lead. He grabbed my arm, his grip like iron. His breath was hot and stale as he leaned in. Panic surged through me as I realized the danger that I was in. "Please, don't," I begged, but he ignored me. His hands were everywhere, and I felt trapped. It was a nightmare I couldn't wake from. He was relentless, and I was powerless to stop him. It felt like time had stopped, but I was acutely aware of every horrifying second. When he finally let me go, I was left in a heap on the floor, my clothes torn and my body shaking. He left me there, saying nothing, just walking out as if nothing had happened. I felt humiliated, violated, and utterly alone. The worst part was knowing that this wasn't a one-time thing. Harris became a regular presence in my life, each visit a reminder of what he had done. I knew I couldn't report him. Who would believe me? Besides, there were whispers amongst the other inmates about how Harris had a reputation. I was stuck in a vicious cycle where I had to endure his abuse to avoid his wrath. Some people think female prisons aren't as bad as men's facilities, that we're somehow spared from the brutality and corruption. My story proves that that isn't the case. Inmates who noticed my bruises and distant demeanor started to question. I tried to deflect, but the rumors spread. I was labeled as someone who had special treatment from Harris. It only made things worse. The other prisoners became hostile, and I was isolated even more. The fear of Harris's visits was constant. Every knock on the door sent my heart racing. Every shadow made me flinch. The guards didn't help. They were either indifferent or complicit. I felt like a piece of meat, prey to a predator who had all the power. One day, Harris came into my cell while I was alone. He didn't say a word, just stood there, a smirk playing on his lips. I knew what was coming. My heart pounded in my chest as he approached, his footsteps echoing in my tiny cell. The wall seemed to close in on me. I braced myself, trying to prepare for the inevitable, when suddenly, the door burst open. Another guard walked in, catching Harris in the act. Harris quickly stepped back, his expression shifting to one of anger. He barked orders at the guard, and within moments, I was left alone with another officer who barely looked at me. The reprieve was brief. Harris had retreated, but he left behind a trail of fear and anger. I lived in a constant state of dread, knowing that Harris would find a way to retaliate. His visits became more sporadic, but more violent when they happened. I was left in a state of constant anxiety, never knowing when the next incident would occur. As time passed, I tried to cope with the trauma in my own way. I learnt to keep my distance from the guards and other inmates, using my isolation as a shield. I began to study the patterns, the routines, anything that could give me a slither of control over my life. But the fear never fully left me. I had to find a way to survive each day, knowing that my tormentor could strike at any moment. Now, as I look back on those days, the memories are still fresh. The fear, the helplessness, the constant vigilance, it's all a part of me. I tell my story not for sympathy, but to share the light on the reality of prison life and the abuse that can occur behind bars. Officer Harris used his power to exploit me, and I paid a heavy price for being a victim in a system that failed to protect me. My experience is a harsh reminder of how fragile safety can be in a place where control is an illusion and trust is a dangerous gamble. I've been a prison guard long enough to witness my share of horrors. The kind of stuff that keeps you awake at night, makes you question how you ended up in this line of work. But there's one night that stands out, a nightmare I can't shake. It started like any other night. I was making my rounds, checking cells, ensuring everything was in order. The prison was unusually quiet, too quiet. I passed by the isolation unit, where we kept some of the worst offenders. It's not a place anyone wants to end up. That's where we had an inmate who had drawn more hatred than anyone I had ever seen. Around midnight, I heard a commotion coming from the isolation unit. Shouts, screams, the unmistakable sound of fists meeting flesh. I rushed over, my heart pounding. I swung open the heavy steel door to a scene that stopped me dead in my tracks. The inmate was on the floor, surrounded by a dozen other prisoners. They had somehow managed to get through his cell door, something I still can't explain. They were attacking him with a savage fury, using makeshift knives, broken broom handles, and their bare hands. The sight was so gruesome, it felt unreal. I moved to intervene, but the scene was too chaotic. The prisoners were in a frenzy, their faces twisted with rage and glee. I had to force my way through them, physically pulling them off the inmate. His face was a mask of blood and bruises, his clothes in tatters. His screams had turned into pitiful gurgling noises. It was like a mob had descended on him, driven by something much darker than mere revenge. When I finally got the attackers restrained, the reality of the situation hit me hard. The victim was barely recognizable. A broken, battered shell. The medical team arrived, but their efforts were futile. The damage was too extensive. As the chaos subsided and the prison returned to its uneasy silence, the truth emerged. The inmate they had so brutally torn apart was a child predator. A man who had molested his own daughter. The prisoner's rage was fueled not just by his crimes, but by the sickening details of his offences. The fact that he preyed on a child, his own flesh and blood, was the kind of horror that ignited a primal fury in anyone who heard about it. The aftermath was a blur of paperwork and investigations, but the scene left an indelible mark on my soul. It wasn't just the brutality. It was the cold, unrelenting justice emitted out by the other prisoners, a visceral reminder of the darkest corners of human nature. Every night, as I walk the dimly lit corridors, the memory of that night haunts me. The blood-soaked floor, the twisted faces of the attackers, and the horrifying truth of the victims' crimes replay in my mind. It's a reminder of the brutal reality that lurks behind these walls. A nightmare that refuses to let go.